In this video, we're fortunate to have with us Professor Clive Agnew. Clive is our Vice President of Teaching, Learning and Students here at the University of Manchester and is also a Professor of Physical Geography. He was formerly our Head of the School of Environment and Development and the Head of Geography. His research is around applied climatology. So, welcome, thanks for joining us, Clive. So, Clive, could you tell us a little bit about the research you do here at the University of Manchester?
I started off working on areas of water shortages and drought, particularly in areas of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. But more recently, I've been working on impacts of climatic change in the uplands of England, but also looking at how we can manage water resources in urban areas in developing countries.
So, Clive, I'd like to ask you first, what are the main threats from climatic change to the UK?
Primarily, these are presented in terms of precipitation changes, mainly wetter winters and drier summers, and associated changes in temperatures. But in actual fact, the impacts of those in the hydrological cycle can be presented in terms of increased flooding events and increased drought. There's also associated changes in terms of water degradation as well.
So the threats that are faced in the UK, are these the same as we see in other parts of the world?
I think in terms of extreme events, that's the same presentation. But I think what we need to remember is that in the UK, 60% of consumption is through household consumption. In the rest of the world, we look to agriculture, where 70 to 80% of the water consumption is through agriculture. So in actual fact, the impacts are going to be very different in different parts of the world.
And that's because of the different ways that people are using water, then?
Exactly. And also there are many opportunities of recycling in terms of household water use. In agricultural use, quite often the water is exported as virtual water, so it leaves the immediate environment.
Clive, from what I've read about your research, one of the main challenges that will face UK policymakers in dealing with climate change in the water sector will be the issue of uncertainty. Is that true?
It is true that there's a reasonable consensus around predictions of climatic change in the UK. There is still problems with temporal uncertainty going into the future, making predictions of what will happen in the future, and also around spatial, i.e. the actual scale of those predictions. But the more fundamental problem is that we have a focus on temperature. But for water resources, we really need to focus on precipitation and evaporation. And it's evaporation that's probably the most challenging of these, where it's actually we found it quite difficult, in fact, to predict what will happen in the future.
So there is uncertainty around the evaporation part of the predictions?
Yes, and it's absolutely critical because the way in which heat stress can be mitigated is related to green structures and therefore evaporation. But also if you start dealing with the effects on vegetation and crops, again, evaporation is the key factor that can be mitigated by irrigation. But without irrigation, one can expect to have higher heat stress.
So what policy approaches do we have in the UK at the moment, and are they the same as in other parts of the world?
Well, across the world, there are a number of policies which are emerging, which are fairly common. Clearly, infrastructure improvement plays a large role. A greater emphasis upon integrated water resource management, pollution control, water conservation and recycling, and sometimes even moving from non-traditional sources, such as desalination. And we can see all of these manifested in different ways in the UK. The challenge in the UK is that, in fact, since privatisation in 1989, we have a variety of different institutions that have a role to play within climatic change responses. And certainly the two terms of adaptation and mitigation are to the fore. And it may be interesting to discuss further what the roles of adaptation are within the UK context.
Because there is work, I mean, there's various policy from the government bodies, such as the Department for Environment and so on mitigation, but adaptation it's a more diffuse issue, really, isn't it? And it does involve more stakeholders in making it work.
Well, I think you're exactly right, Duncan. I think the issue about stakeholder engagement is actually at the forefront of that discussion. Quite often we're looking for tools which can actually help us to change behaviour. And they can range from economic tools through social learning and other mechanisms. But this move, if you like, from environmental sustainability and environmental engineering through to stakeholder engagement really embraces the whole realm of adaptation.
And is anywhere, I mean, is the UK doing it well, or is anywhere else in the world doing stakeholder engagement well around this issue?
That's interesting. I've come across a number of different examples.
Okay.
Most recently, South Africa has been very challenged in terms of having stakeholder engagement. It's enshrined in their water policies. But in practice, what they are sort of finding is that the asymmetries of power make it very difficult for all stakeholders to be treated equally. But I have seen examples from New Zealand, from Bangladesh, where in fact stakeholder engagement seems to be very much at the fore. One of the interesting developments in this is to move us from what might be called the public education model, where the science, the experts pass down the ideas and the strategies, through towards a co-production model where stakeholders are engaged at the forefront of developing the strategies. And those are quite two extremes which the UK is trying to develop, but I think it's still been quite a challenge.
Mm-hmm. So Clive, the issues that you just mentioned there, a lot of those are kind of supply side tools, as it were. What about the demand side of things?
Well, that's right. Traditionally, we have emphasised tackling problems of water shortages through enhancing supply. I think increasingly over the last couple of decades, there are a variety of tools around the area of demand management, and these include both economic tools, also human behavioural tools, but also technology as well can actually help in reducing consumption and reducing demand. In the UK, one of the obstacles is that by and large we don't have a metered population, we don't have water meters. So we actually are charged on our water use by the size and value of our property, which is very good for revenue collection, but actually makes it much more difficult to use pricing mechanisms to control demand.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a little bit about that in next week's videos when I talk about the history of the UK and its development path and the link to property tax and so on. But it is quite challenging when you're not linking to water usage or number of people in the household. I mean, how much control do you have over demand management in the absence of the metering and the link to volumetric knowledge, really? There
is a debate about the use of economic tools to control demand, and there are questions about the elasticity of demand for water, which I'm sure we'll cover in other parts in this course. Therefore, there has to be other approaches as well than simply using pricing tools. In addition, the problem in the UK is because of the lack of metering, we have a system whereby it's very effective for revenue generation, but it's very difficult then to translate people's consumption to people's behaviour.
And I understand that there are national plans from recent legislation on this issue, is that right?
That's right. If I recall, the Climatic Change Act of 2008 created national action plans where there's an emphasis upon efficiency gains, also on stakeholder engagement and disseminating information and providing advice alongside the Committee on Climatic Change. It's interesting to note that the water utilities are currently going through a pricing regulation discussion with Ofwat, the regulator, for 2014 to 15, which in theory could actually include costs to combat climate change. But in looking at the current debates, although it's in the background, it's much more about environmental enhancement rather than I can find specifically tackling climatic change per se.
And has that, since the privatisation in England and Wales in 1989, has that always been the case that I guess climate change has only emerged more recently as an issue, but was it dealt with previously and is now on the back burner, or is it just, has it been a kind of in the background the whole time?
What I would say is that the necessary improvements in the environment and the use of the water environment has been embedded since 1989. What we've seen is the imperative of climatic change coming forward sometimes manifests more in terms of mitigation and energy costs than actually water resource consumption and water resource stress. But it's there in the background, it seems to me, but I couldn't actually find it being very carefully and very overtly stated.
And so what is the role of the UK water utilities in all of this?
Well, I think it's worthwhile remembering that, of course, the pressures on the utilities are not coming solely from climatic change. We are having increased demand for water through household composition changes, also increasing amount of households being constructed. And, of course, utilities have to respond to those demands of both supplying water and dealing with the sanitation. So climatic change, in a sense, puts challenges on top of what is already happening in terms of changes in the demands for water supply and management of the water environment.
So are there parts of the world where the water system is integrated into the planning for, demographic changes, housing changes and so on?
The objective is to have integrated water management in many parts of the world. Whether that's truly achieved is questionable, and the reason I would suggest that it is a challenge is that quite often the idea of integrated water management tends to be couched in either environmental and sometimes economic terms. Really what needs to happen is it has to involve both communities and social objectives alongside the economic and environmental, and very rarely do you get that full integration across the full watershed.
So it's coming back to the issues around stakeholder engagement that we talked about as well.
I think the challenges with climatic change and water resource management today are as much about environment as about the stakeholder and community engagement. And I think where we are learning slowly how to deal with this is much more how we get that engagement with people in communities.
And so what is the public perception about climate change in the UK at the moment, would you say?
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climatic Change has been quite clear in 2013 that the evidence of greenhouse warming and the effect on climate and then on water resources is unequivocal. But still, I think there is a polarisation of views where some people do not fully believe that this is the case, even though the science, I would say, is quite clear. So it's much more about the impacts and whether we need to take the impacts seriously, whether in fact water resource problems through climate change are the most pressing problems facing the UK, and to some extent whether people are actually willing, therefore, to pay for the solutions that are being promoted.
And so is water pricing then a tool that we can use to address climate change adaptation or mitigation issues?
I'm not totally convinced it is, for a couple of reasons. I think first of all, we don't have the infrastructure in place, but let's assume we did have the infrastructure. It's still basically you want to change people's behaviour, and the evidence there's only certain groups of the population that are likely to change their behaviour. The very poor with few assets are not able to, and others are probably likely to pass the costs on to elsewhere. So we're actually looking at a particular group, the middle classes if you like, where this is going to have an impact. And whether that will have a significant impact over a sustained period of time is again questionable. So I think the jury's out as to whether water truly has an elasticity of demand for that population.
Mm-hmm. And we've heard a little bit about this week as well about an American experiment and this on a social treatment. Is there anywhere in the world where water price, is a good way to address climate change issues?
I think one of the examples coming out of the Mediterranean was where people were very opposed to pricing as a matter of principle, but when asked how much they were paying for water, couldn't actually articulate that. So I think people are against water pricing. But I think the real challenge is explaining where the money is going to. And without hypothecation, the fear is, of course, this money is just going into either the exchequer or into the privatised company and is not actually benefiting those who are actually contributing to the cost.
Mm-hmm. And in the UK, of course, we've had a kind of, since privatisation in 1989, we've had a history of price rises above inflation anyway to address previous underinvestment and the environmental obligations that you've talked about. So, it's not as if people are facing perhaps price increases for climate change against a flat level. It's a continuation of a trend, and they may question again, why are water bills constantly going up?
And I think that's a good question and a good challenge to make. But I think also to be balanced, we can see vast improvements in the environment in the UK, in England and Wales since privatisation in 1989, in terms of water quality in particular. So there have definitely been benefits, it seems to me, in terms of that investment. But of course, the question always is who pays and are those at appropriate level?
Yeah, and I guess whether the benefits will be sustainable now with climate change as an additional factor as well, perhaps.
My personal view is that we need to be able to adapt to extremes, and that can be done through technology and through investments which will cost. But I think there are also opportunities to increase people's resilience and adaptation through other mechanisms. And I'd like to see a balanced approach which actually emphasised the way in which communities can work to combat climate change alongside the more technological engineering approaches. I think it's interesting that London is building a desalination plant along with other mega cities around the world, such as Barcelona and Sydney. And I'm not saying they're doing that for climatic change purposes, but it's basically in response to an increase in demand. And climatic change does forecast an increased demand through weather extremes.
So we've mentioned a few times about water shortages as part of the climate change issue. What about flooding as well? We've had that recently in the UK, and we've had, seen quite severe floods around the world in recent years. What do we do to deal with flooding?
Well, it is interesting that in 2012, in fact, in the UK, the media was focusing upon drought. In 2014, the media is focusing upon flooding. And you're quite right that both extremes of climatic change need to be taken into account. The curiosity about this year, 2014, is that I would have said that the focus has changed much more from fluvial flooding, which is flooding coming from the channel itself and basically water arriving too quickly, to much more overwhelming urban drainage. And so we get into this idea of what's called pluvial flooding. And pluvial flooding is really quite a challenge because it can occur anywhere, but is more likely to occur where there is underinvestment in urban areas, and particularly in the poor areas. But what happened this year is we just had so much water. So in one sense, we've moved the debate away from this idea of pluvial, sustainable urban drainage issues towards good old-fashioned, too much water arriving in large volumes, which is what we've experienced this year.
So Clive, we've had a very UK and very climate change focused discussion. What do you think beyond the UK and beyond climate change are the other main issues for water management at the moment?
I think as we look beyond the UK shores, one of the issues that one has to grapple with is the growth in agricultural demand, particularly for meat products, and the higher water requirements through livestock production, which is still stimulating the growth in irrigation and associated with that dam construction, but also the growth of megacities. What we can see basically is that the growth of cities, particularly in developing countries, is so much more rapid than appeared 100 years ago. So the rate of increase is greater, and within that the inequalities and the urban poverty is also greater. And so I think alongside the impacts of climatic change, we're having to deal with the megacity demand for water and the growing irrigation and agricultural demand for water.
Clive, you've mentioned several times community and stakeholder engagement. What are the challenges around doing that well?
I think the issue is really perhaps asymmetries of power, that stakeholder groups don't all have the same knowledge base nor the same resources, and tend to operate either through what we might call a co-production model, where they're working with NGOs and other institutions, or they might be working through collective action, through engagement with other similar groups in the community. And really what you need to do is have both groups working effectively together, but then also they have to be welcomed and engaged with by the institutions who are managing water. So it's not simply a case of engaging in a consultation. I think they actually have to be there in the decision making. And it's the latter which is the most difficult to actually accept, because we still basically manage water through a top-down, expert-driven model. And I think not everybody is really prepared for co-production.